Here we are in the volumes chapter, and in this section I'm going to be doing a little bit of an intro to how volumetric simulation works in Houdini just by doing a couple simple examples, and then we'll get into a cooler examples later on in this chapter. But for right now, all I want to do is just sort of dissect a couple shelf setups so that we can understand what really is going on inside of these sims. So at this point, you might be wondering, why are we using the shelf tools so much? Well, there's actually a lot we can learn from what Houdini already has built into itself. And I think that at this point, there's been so much information thrown at you that setting up things from scratch 100% of the time is going to be overkill when there's already so many good presets that can get us started. And then we can kind of tweak things on our own to really drive and get the results that we want. So I think that we also should get comfortable with using the shelf at this point, because really it is going to be our cheat sheet. And it serves as my cheat sheet in many situations when I'm building my own setups for client projects and everything else. So you may be familiar with how volumes work in other programs. For example, we've got the volume builder in C4D, which is generally used for like modeling and or effects that look like simulations but might not necessarily be simulations. Similarly, the VDB tools in Houdini can do a lot of volume builder like stuff. But what this section is really going to be covering is like the dynamic version of that. So dynamic versions of simulation, volumetric simulation would be things like turbulence FD, fume effects, and in our case, pyro. The pyro system in Houdini is what really kind of the same idea as what is occurring in those other packages. So over here in Houdini, if it wasn't really 100% clear as to how volumes really are set up, let's just go through this quick little example. No need to follow along, just a setup that I have, and I'll include it in the file that we provide with the course. So suppose you're taking a picture of an image. And your subject is this pig head. What you would generally, and suppose you also wanted to have this pig head on an alpha channel, so that it was, had a transparent background, like a PNG file you could overlay over anything. Really, this is sort of the process that you would go through. You'd sort of define like, you would take a picture of it, and you define where the bounds of that image would be. So you define the resolution of the sensor of the camera that you're using to take the image or whatnot. And then you would, this resolution would sort of determine the quality of that image. And then what you would do is you would actually do like an alpha cutout. If you wanted to get that pig head on like sort of a transparent background. So that might be defined as, something like this, just like a little region that kind of outlines the shape of the pig head based off of the resolution of the images that you had. So these pixels are the only ones that are going to be, active in terms of having an alpha channel. So then the last thing you would do is you'd rasterize the pixels to that resolution. And you can see that this is pretty low resolution, but if you were to crank up the resolution, let's say to, bring the particles closer together, you would end up with something that looks like this, which is a much higher resolution image, much more representative of the actual subject. So the same thing goes for volumes. I'm just going to turn this back down a little bit. Let's bring it down to maybe 0.05. So with volumes, we're doing the same thing, except for dealing with pixels, we're actually dealing with voxels. So you can see that here what we've done is we've taken our subject, we've created a grid in which that subject will exist, and this is our voxel grid for basically three-dimensional pixel. And then what we do is we sort of define an area that is our alpha, where we cut out the area that we want to kind of focus on. And this really, I like to think of density in this way. Density is really sort of the substance or where actual smoke simulation is visible. It's not like there are still other things going on outside of the density field, but I sort of like to think of it as the alpha channel of a volumetric simulation. And density typically appears to us in the form of like wispy smoke, or something to that effect. And then the last thing we do is, now that we've defined this density, we can apply to it all the other properties that are important to get it to represent the volume. And that's sort of what this is, this voxelized representation of the density with all the properties that we want on it. So essentially at this point, much like pixels in an image, each voxel is storing a bunch of information such as color and position and all that. Except when we are doing a dynamic simulation, these voxels can all hold much more information than just simply color and density or alpha. Really, what these voxels are capable of is storing things like temperature, heat, fuel, and also velocity, and then advecting those from one to the next. So, if we had, some form of density or some form of velocity that was, pushing in this direction, it would not only push density between the voxels, but also kind of advect that velocity into its neighbors as well, until we get these nice swirly effects that behave like real life phenomena. There are a lot of different settings that go into creating a pyro simulation, and a lot of different attributes that are carried through the voxels as they simulate, and it can be quite a bit to kind of wrap your head around at first, but with a little bit of time and practice with this kind of stuff, you eventually get the hang of understanding the terminology that goes into creating a smoke simulation. So with this as our base, let's just get into doing a little bit more of an example that we can explore based off of the shelf. So what I'm going to do is just disable this node right here. I'll call this the voxel head example. And then we're going to move over to create a new setup. So I'm going to throw it on a sphere. And what we're going to do is, by default, right now I'm in the build desktop right here. If we go up to our shelf up here and go to Pyro Effects over here, you can see that we've got a bunch of sort of standard setups that we can kind of choose from. Things like flames, explosions, fireballs, billowy smoke, colored smoke, wispy smoke, smokeless flame, dry ice, all this stuff. All really cool, really handy starting points for when you want to kind of create these different types of effects. What we want to do right now is let's just start with billowy smoke. The reason I'm starting with billowy smoke is because it's a little bit simpler than combustion. We'll get into the combustion section, in a little bit. But for right now, I'm just going to click that with the sphere selected. I clicked billowy smoke, and this is what I get. If I click play, you can see that it is creating this sort of billowy smoke, and it's just sort of almost like. Just sort of like a factory smokestack that is more or less just emitting smoke out, and it's just rising through the seam. It's pretty difficult to see what's going on here. So a lot of times what I like to do when I'm working with smoke in Houdini, even though I might not be rendering it in Houdini, is I'll throw down a light. So I'm going to go over to lights and cameras here, and I'm going to pick a camera angle that I want. Like maybe I'll be looking at my sim from this angle. So I want a light coming from the upper left. So I'm just going to navigate up to the upper left over here, and then hold down the control key and click area light. And you can see that creates a light for us. And as long as I have this lock not selected, once I move away, you can see that it leaves my light in place of where I left it. And now when we look at our smoke simulation, it looks much more, there's a little bit of shading on there. So if I go back to the light and disable it, it becomes very flat, but now you can actually see some sort of shading to that light, which is cool. Let's just look at what the network has created for us. So if I just zoom back out, you can see a lot of times it'll put some of these nodes in not directly in your view. You just got to be aware of that. So what it's created for us, I'm going to get my area light. I'll just put that up there. So over here, we've got our sphere that we initially created, and an auto.network and a pyro import. Basically, the auto.network is where the sim is happening. So let's call this the smoke sim. And then the pyro import is where we bring the data out of the sim and get it, cached out and ready for rendering. And then additionally, it's also added some stuff to our sphere. So if I just dive in here, we can see that it has created a few nodes for us. These ones down here. Initially, we started with just the sphere, but it has created a density, a pyro source node, which creates our density for us. The pyro source is more or less just a scatter node with a few extra features built in. So I'm just going to go back to frame 0, and I'm going to go up here and say hide other objects, so we can just focus on what our sourcing object is doing. So initially we started with a sphere, and so the shelf tool has added to it for us a pyro source node. So the pyro source node is more or less a scatter node with some extra attributes attached to it that are super handy in creating different types of smoke simulations. In our case, density and temperature have been added so that we can sort of first off create density and then apply some temperature to allow it to rise into the atmosphere, because hot air rises, and if we supply temperature, it will allow the buoyancy force to bring it into the air and billow up like a smokestack. So then the next thing that that has been added for us here is this attribute noise node. And you can see what it's doing is it's taking in the position information and then modifying the density and temperature attributes by applying an animated noise and remapping that between a certain bound. It's got some other distribution remapping going on right here. And in general, it's just an animated noise. We can't really see it doing anything, but if I were to throw it on a visualize node and just wire that off to the side over here, and let's go to the visualizers tab, and I'm just going to choose density. You can see if I now click play, this red value is sort of representing the different density values that are being modified by this noise, this attribute noise node. Let me just hit the D key and increase the point marker size and the point size. Make it a little bit more obvious. You can see that density kind of just sort of moving through this noise pattern. So now that we've created noise, and that noise is being applied to both density and temperature in the same way, then what happens is this node right here, the rasterized node, will take that density and temperature information and turn it into volume. So you can see up here, if I middle mouse click on this attribute noise, you can see there's 4 point attributes: density, P scale P, and temperature. So this density and temperature attribute exists as point attributes, and then this volume rasterize attribute, if I middle mouse click, you can see that it is churning that into density and temperature VDBs for us. So there's 2 VDBs here, and one of them's density, the other one's temperature. And now if you look up top here, you can actually see that it is specifying the particle group that was created by the add noise and the attributes that it's turning into density now, or that it's turning into volumes. You can see that there's some extra ones in here like fuel, color, alpha, and velocity that it will turn into volumes if they're supplied, but we haven't supplied any by default with this setup. So basically, we're just getting that density and temperature VDB. And ultimately, from all of this, if I just jump back out to the object level, go back to frame 0 and click play, again, that density and temperature create this smoke color and the hot air rising effect that we see right here. Now, just to show that we can modify some stuff outside of the sim, let's jump in and just create our own attribute, and we'll add an additional field for velocity to kind of noise up this emission even more. So let's just jump back into our sphere. Let's just actually jump back out. I'm going to name this our emitter for now, just to sort of, name this something that means something. And then let's just get back in here and see what we can do by adding our own custom velocity. I think that we've done stuff like this before with attribute noise, so let's just use another attribute noise. I'm going to throw down an attribute noise. And the reason why I'm using a different attribute noise and not just attaching velocity into the attributes up here is because this is a one-dimensional. Density and temperature are scalar fields, and we need to create a vector field. So having this one-dimensional noise is going to do us no good when we're creating velocities. So let's go down to this attribute noise that we created down here. I'm just going to highlight it, and you can see by default it's making these kind of rainbowy colors on our sphere because it's modifying color attribute. We want to modify the velocity, so I'm just going to delete out the color and replace it with the V, and that makes the color go away. But then if I turn on my volume or my velocity trails over here, nothing really happens, and I think that that's really due to the fact that the vector size is a little bit small. So if I hit the D key, I'm going to go over to my guides and just maybe scale up my vectors. And you can see those green trails beginning to appear. And if I really drag them past using the ladder, you can really see them sort of showing up. Now, so all this velocity noise that we're adding is sort of going off into one direction, in sort of a uniform direction, which isn't really what we want. So I want noise that kind of randomly goes out in all directions. So the way I can kind of fix that is by clicking this center noise button. You can see that we really start to get this noise that's kind of going in all sorts of different directions. And we can mess around with the element size. Maybe I'll just keep it to something a little bit more, something a little bit lower frequency like that. And then we can allow it to animate as well. So if I click the play button here, you can see that noise is flying all over the place. I think it's probably going faster than it needs to because this real-time button is not enabled. So I'm just going to click that and then click play again. You can kind of see this is sort of the rate that velocity is going to be changing for our emission. And if I go down here and maybe just bring the roughness down slightly so it's a little bit smoother in its motion, that looks good. So now, if I go down to this volume rasterize attributes and middle mouse click, you can see that we get a V attribute added to our sim. So let's pop back out to our object level. I'm going to hit escape and go back to frame 0. And I'm going to hide the emitter and the pyro import and just enable the smoke sim. And let's click play. And it doesn't look like what we did much to add any velocity to our scene. And that's because we haven't really I could scale this up. So let's go back to the emitter, and where we've got our attribute noise here, I could just increase this amplitude to some insane number like maybe 22. Let's see what that looks like. Hop back up and click play. Now you can see that velocity field is having a huge impact on these on the emission that is going on in our pyro sim. You can see that it's just blasting smoke all over the place, whereas before it wasn't really doing that. So that is one way that you can actually just sort of show you how much how much impact the input can have on the way the sim looks. I'm going to just bring this attribute noise for the velocity back down to its original value, something like 1. Sorry, it was 1, 1, and 1. And it's not having that much effect on the sim, but we can actually modify the effect that it has on the simulation side. And I generally like to leave all the things that are running into my sim on sort of a 0 to 1 basis so that I can do all my scaling and tweaking on the sim side and sort of know where what values I'm working with on what's incoming into the scene. Cool. So then the last thing we've got over here in sourcing is that we've got this out density and render. I mean, basically these, if we wanted to render this node, we could, it's basically set to render nothing no matter what we have displayed here, which is handy. Because there's nothing flowing into this render node. And then we've got this out density, which is being read in by our sourcing inside of our pyro sim. So now let's go and look at what we've got inside of the inside of our DOP network here. This is where all the magic is happening. So it looks like we've got a smoke object here on the left, and we're attaching it. We're feeding it into a pyro solver that is attaching a resize container, and which helps us kind of crop in on a region of interest for our sim. It helps make the sim run faster in general by only focusing on the region of it that has anything to sim. And then we have our volume source, which is bringing in our source volume and applying it to our smoke object. And then we got a merge that isn't really doing anything right now, and then a gravity node to apply gravity, which it seems like it's not really doing anything because it's kind of not, because we got this buoyancy force going on. So, but it's there in case we need it. And yeah, that's really what's making up this pyrosim. So let's like dig in a little bit deeper now. Going back to the smoke object, let's take a look at it. If I select it, you can see that we've got this properties tab up here. This properties tab contains a bunch of important information such as the size of our grid and the positioning of it, and also the division size. So this is really like what we were talking about in the very, very beginning. This is really like how we determine the resolution. You can kind of see on this box that we have here, there's these little hash marks on the side that are supposed to help indicate what the resolution of this sim is based off of our division size. For me, I find that it works a lot better for me to work in terms of the space, the resolution along each axis, whereas this is just literally giving me the voxel size. If I were to change this division size to something like max axis, here I can actually define how many voxel unit lengths I want it to be along whichever axis the sim determines is the longest. In our case, that would be the y-axis. So you can see there's 10 divisions along this y-axis here. Now, 10 divisions is way too low for any sim that would make any sort of sense. So, as you can see, so what I would typically like to do is I like to set this to a value of around 150. So that's 150 voxels tall, and then whatever it is to make up the, to achieve the size of our grid based off of its world space, you know, length, width, and height. So I find that 150 seems to be a pretty good balance between speed and actually being able to see what the sim looks like. You can see that there's a little bit of detail. It's not fantastic when you get close up, but if you're just like trying to work out a general shape or general behavior, it works out pretty great. Now you can see, you know, when I actually would be doing a sim, you know, for maybe like I'm prototyping, I might crank this up to 350, and then even further when I actually am creating like a final sim, I might do something like a resolution of like 600 or higher. You know, obviously, you know, the higher resolution you go with your grid, the longer it's going to take to run the sim. Let's take a look at this real quick. If we middle mouse click down here on our pyro, on our smoke object, you can see that right now at 150 divisions, we have a grid. Well, the grid is still resizing, but its max axis at this point is 105, or sorry, is 148, and then you know, all these numbers multiplied together gives us the total number of voxels in our space, which is 1.3, almost 1.4 million voxels. So, you know, your intuition might tell you that when you double this, it actually would double this to, you know, something like 2.8 million voxels. But let's watch what happens when we change this to 300. Now, if I go back and start to simulate this and let it run out, and if I actually, I'm just going to temporarily disable the resize container just so that we're left with our entire voxel grid here, and just run this for a couple frames, and then middle mouse click on the pyro node. You can see that now we're at 13 million voxels. We were at 1.4 million voxels before, and now we're at 13 million voxels. How do we get there? Well, we doubled this, but when we double the resolution of our voxel grid, we're not only doubling its resolution in X and Y space, but we're also doubling it in Z space. So really, a double is raised to the 3. So basically, this is 2 times, it's actually multiplying it by 2 times 2 times 2, which is a multiple of 8. I think if we did 8 times 1.4, we get something close, 1.4 million, we get something close to this new amount that we have here. So it's just an important note to make about scaling. The scaling of these division sizes is that it isn't, you just got to be aware that it scales up maybe a little bit more exponentially than what you're initially thinking. Cool. So I'm just going to return this back down to 150 and yeah. So that's really kind of it for this tab. This top area up here. You can see that right here we've got this closed boundaries section here. Initially what our smoke sim is doing is it is allowed to exit the grid without any sort of collision with the grid. Like this, you can see that it's just leaving. If we wanted it to collide with the grid, we could close these boundaries and then it would do just that. It would start to collide with the bounds. And if I turn this, maybe I'll just bring the size of this down. If I grab my pyro object and switch to my manipulator and bring the ceiling down a little bit and click play, you can see that it actually is colliding and spreading out once it hits the boundaries of this box. And you can specify which boundaries you want to have collisions occur with or not. So I'm going to just undo that and return it to its original size of 7 by 10 by 7. And I'm going to turn off closed boundaries. And then what I'll do is just re-enable the resize container. So the next thing, generally this creation and instancing tab, I don't really mess with those. In general, we don't really need to worry about those right now. So mostly the properties tab, just for determining the resolution and size of our grid. And then down here, we've got some other stuff. We've got our guides section here. This guides section just lets us visualize the different fields that we are inserting into our simulation. So right now, the only one that we have visible is the multi-field. And you can see that we've got this list of multi-field, density, temperature field, divergence, etc. All those fields are sort of listed over here, and we can set a color for them if we want. And then we can actually modify the properties of all those fields across these tabs down here. So we're on the multi-field right now. You can see that it's using this density. It's using the density field. And if I just play this back a little bit, we can actually sort of adjust what the viewport representation of this volume looks like using this multi-visualizer that we have here. So the density scale is set to 2. I could crank this up and it almost looks thicker. I could, increase the shadow density scale or the shadow scale. And you can just kind of mess around to get like sort of a viewport representation that works for you and helps you visualize like what the shape of your smoke is looking like. So handy little features on the guides tab on the multi-solver. Additionally, down here where there's smoke and emission, we're not doing anything with combustion, but emission would handle a little bit of like the combustion stuff if we wanted to. Smoke in general is, you can actually kind of map the smoke off. We could clamp it off if we wanted to, basically change the contrast of the smoke if we wanted to, and such down here. Then, so that's sort of the visualization tab. Now this next tab, initial data, we're not really using this because we're actually sourcing our volume in over here, but that's sort of if you wanted to set an initial data and bring it in and just have it sort of occur once, you could do that here. And then fields and slice, we're not necessarily going to worry about. Fields, we have all of our fields that are being brought in here, and slice is more for setting up distributed simulations. So now let's take a look at the resize container. The resize container we were mentioning before, you can see if I scroll this back, you can see that that container is resizing. It's more or less just trying to limit the amount of voxels that it needs to calculate in order to do the simulation, because by default, this whole entire grid has some form of simulation happening in it, even if it isn't much. Down here in the corners, there's going to be velocity that's occurring, even though we can't see it. There is a velocity field there. This isn't just smoke moving through a vacuum. It's smoke moving through air that has its own sort of almost density. And we kind of simulate that just by using velocity and drag forces and stuff like that. But this resize container more or less will just track this reference field, which is our density, and then it sort of just uses some padding to kind of give it a sort of amount of leeway in which it's going to create its boundary around this smoke object as it expands until eventually it reaches the max bounds here, which is defined by our actual smoke object based off of this clamp. It clamps to the maximum bounds of our actual smoke object. You could turn on the resize container, you could turn clamp to maximum off and your sim would be allowed to resize it would continue getting larger and larger. But if you want to live dangerously, feel free to play around with that. I typically like to set a boundary that I know is the maximum that I'm going to want to deal with. Usually I do it based off of like how my camera is positioned in my scene. I'll set my bounds of my volume to fit around that camera and only sim what I absolutely need to have visible in my camera. And again, this distribution tab right here, not really necessary to worry about right now. Next node is the volume source node. So this node is the node that is really communicating with all that stuff that we did out in SOPs before when we were creating our emitter. You can see that here, what it's doing is it's set to source smoke, and then it has an activation value, and we could animate this the way we do other things. So if I were to say $F is less than 5, it would source smoke into our scene for the first 5 frames, and then it would stop. And you can see that that emitter is no longer continuing to create smoke down here where our sphere was. So good to note that activation is there in case you need it. I'm just going to set it back to 1 to leave it to constantly emit. And then let's look down here at the volumes tab. So the volumes tab is by default creating for us, or not by default, but what the shelf tool set us up was, looks like it's doing 3 operations. So it's creating density, temperature, and velocity for us. You can see what it does is it takes the source volume that we specified over in our SOP source. It's taking that source volume that we created and then mapping it to a target field. It just needs to do this more or less to hook up those VDBs that we were creating to the data that actually makes sense for the simulation to solve. So you can see that density is a scalar, temperature is a scalar, and then down here, velocity is a vector, as we've experienced before. The source volume that is created in SOPs is named V, whereas the volume in Houdini, when we're simming, is called vel. It's just, I don't know why it's different, but I believe based off of the documentation that for historical reasons, and I'm pretty sure that they use the word historical reasons, these have to be named something differently. I'm not 100% sure why, but it's there. So before, when I was talking about setting the amplitude of my velocity in the emitter, I like to set it to 1 so that I can control it on the simulation side. This is the area of the simulation side where I can actually affect what my emitter is doing on this side. So, for example, we cranked our velocity up to a value of something like 22 before. Well, if I come down here to this scale and set this to 22, we start to get that similar type of effect we achieved by just cranking up the amplitude of our noise in our source. So that's sort of, once you start to get into developing the look of your smoke, it's going to be handy to kind of stay over here in working in DOPS, unless you want to do the split view and the quad view and all that stuff, so you can have multiple views up. But for right now, generally I like to kind of do a lot of my, manipulating of at least the scales of these attributes over here on the sim side, but it's all totally, that's all personal preference. Other things to note is that these operations are all by default set to add, but you can use these different sort of more or less compositing options, if you can think of it that way, to basically composite these field values into your simulation and see what kinds of different effects that they have. Generally, I like to stick with whatever the defaults are from the shelf tools. But also these scale attributes can be animated. So if we wanted to scale the density on and off and the velocity in and out, we could do that by keyframing these values. Cool. I'm just going to set this back to 1. All right. So next, the node that is the center of all of the Pyro simulation, the Pyro solver itself. This node has a ton of settings on it, and they all take a little bit to get used to. Pyro typically just has a whole bunch. It's a balancing act of a bunch of different fields that you eventually get used to trying to, feel your way around with. Really what it is just practice. You just got to do a bunch of sims and tweak with all the values and see what you get. So let's go through some of these tabs on the Pyro solver. This initial tab is the simulation. We can mess around with our time scale if we wanted to go slow-mo. And then we've got things like temperature diffusion. Now, all of these, for the most part, they're pretty well documented. These parameters are inside of our inside the Pyro solver. So if I'm hovering over something like viscosity, you can see that it's telling me this is the fluidness of the velocity field. Higher values will make neighboring voxels have the same velocity, creating more flowing look. So you can really hover over these, and it's kind of great because they actually tell you what these parameters are supposed to affect. So temperature diffusion in general is just about how much it's blurring out the temperature field, and the cooling rate. So blurring of the temperature field is going to cause it to average out more over the space inside of the sim. And the cooling rate is going to influence how much it is actually just being cooled every second. So if we set the cooling rate super high, you can see that the smoke isn't rising as fast anymore. And because it is being forced to cool so fast, if I turn this cooling rate way down, you can see that that hot air is rising and it's not slowing down very much at all. So if I undo that, and I'm going to undo that, there you can see we're back to where we were. So temperature diffusing and cooling rate will kind of affect how much that temperature stops influencing our sim, because things do dissipate in nature, and so that's sort of how you can control that. Now, this buoyancy lift is really what is telling that temperature the direction in which it should rise. So if we're creating some hot gas in here, and we want to set our buoyancy direction to like along the z-axis, it really is almost like you can see that it's almost behaving like we're setting it's almost like we're setting the gravity. I feel like buoyancy is the sort of the opposing direction. It should be the opposing direction of the gravity of your scene for the the temperature to rise accordingly. So I'm just going to set this back to 1. And all this buoyancy stuff can really kind of help if you're trying, depending on what type of effect you're trying to create. If you're trying to create rising smoke, then you definitely want some buoyancy. If you turn that off and you just click play, your sim just simply emits smoke and kind of stays in place. So a couple different ways to control the speed at which the sim determines how much it should move away from the source based off of these cooling rates and buoyancies. So I'm going to set that back to 4. So the next tab is the combustion tab. This is a whole bunch of features just like the ones we messed with that will help determine how to create fire-like effects and explosions in your simulation. We're going to skip over that for right now, and we're just going to jump over to the shape tab. You can see that by default, we've got our dissipation, disturbance, and turbulence effects turned on. If I disable all of those and play our sim back, it's pretty. You can see how it gets much more bulbous and simplified. And that's really just our velocity field creating sort of that variation. If I were to scale down the velocity field that we're adding into our scene based off of our emitter, this would get much more boring. Actually, it doesn't change much because that velocity field wasn't affecting much. If I jump back over to our emitter and I was to maybe not add any noise to the density or temperature and just play back this sim, you'd see that it is very much just like we are creating a completely uniform mushroom-like effect that is rather, I mean, it could be interesting depending on what you're trying to do with it, but it really doesn't have that much character to it, which is why we want to be doing things like adding noises and stuff like that to our inputs. So while we add noise to the inputs, we can also add noise here on that shaping tab of our sim. So things like disturbance are going to immediately, if I crank up this disturbance to a really high value, you can see how much more gnarled up this smoke sim is starting to get. And likewise, if I turn disturbance off, we also have like a turbulence setting here. If I play this back, you can see there's a little bit of variation created by the turbulence, but to really see what that's doing, we'll just crank it up a little bit higher. And you can really kind of see how that's adding some additional warbliness into our smoke sim. And so really getting your shape is kind of about dialing all these settings the way you want them. So yeah, disturbance and turbulence are really sort of like noises that are added to your smoke to get some cool looks. Shredding and sharpening are similar effects that you can use to kind of help shape fire and smoke in your sim as well. So I invite you to definitely check out all those. The dissipation, I'm just going to turn the others off and we'll play with dissipation real quick. Dissipation is more or less how, like what we were talking about with the temperature cooling and the temperature what was it called? Temperature diffusion. Dissipation is more or less going to kind of determine how quickly the smoke fades away. So right now it's not dissipating very much at all, but if I was to crank this dissipation up to a very high number like 0.9 and click play, we might see that smoke starting to disappear much quicker. And it's kind of not easy to see, but you can see it's starting to disappear up at the top here. If I crank this dissipation up to something like 5, you can see if I go back to 0, crank it up to 5, you can see it's really going to start to disappear before it gets to the top. We go insane with it, like 20. Really, it's dissipating quite quickly. And really kind of creating some interesting shapes while it's doing it. And now down here, for all these different settings that we have that we were messing with up here, down here we have all sorts of different ways to control these different shapes. So for example, I'm going to put dissipation back to, I think it was 0.2, or yeah, we'll just go with 0.2. It didn't seem to be having that great of an effect. If I turn back on disturbance and go to the disturbance tab, you can see that you can set which fields it's going to disturb. So we're disturbing velocity, which is what is causing it to change the speed of these little density fields around the edge. So it's disturbing the velocity and it's having an effect on the density that is below it. You can choose like the block size. This is sort of what I think of as like the frequency. So if I increase the block size to something like 3, you can see that that density is having, or that disturbance is having a much broader effect on the simulation. Let's bring it back down to 0.3. And then you can see that you have these different control fields. So basically you can use your control field like temperature to influence how much disturbance is occurring. So it will disturb areas that have higher temperature more than areas with lower temperature. Same thing goes with shredding and sharpness and turbulence. A lot of these settings are very similar. You can see turbulence, which was initially set up for us. We have a swirl size, which is like your frequency, and your grain and pulse length. A lot of these are all like, this pulse length is how quickly the turbulence field animates. And you can also have a control setting here. Basically what it's saying is it's using the density field to control how much turbulence is occurring. So typical noise settings on your turbulence here as well. Other tabs up at the top here, we've got color. This is for adding and controlling controlling the dissipation of color in your sim if you've got a colored smoke sim. And then relationships, I'm not going to really worry about this for right now. And then under advanced, I'm not going to really worry about any of this right now, except for use OpenCL. This one really seems to help things move a little bit quicker. So with OpenCL off, our sim is kind of moving this fast. At this low of a resolution, it might not make that much of a difference, but I'll turn OpenCL on, click play again. And to me, it feels like that's moving faster. And this will move faster for larger simulations. But a thing to note is that OpenCL has a lower memory limit than what your actual VRAM on your graphics card is. And you can run out of it pretty easily running some high-res sims in Houdini. So just an important note to make about that. Use it if you can, but if you can't, there's always your CPU there and whatever RAM resources you have available in your computer to do to go in for the long haul with a really heavy simulation. Now that we've kind of gone over just sort of generally what all this stuff is, let's do some other cool things. Like I'm going to actually maybe return my, let's go back to my Pyro Solver and my shape. And I'm just going to crank the disturbance back down to a value near what we had originally, so it isn't getting so destroyed. Something like that should do. And then what I want to do is let's try adding some color here. So color used to be really difficult to do, at least in Houdini with smoke. But now they've made it a lot easier. So easy that they even threw down under our Pyro Effects tab here, a couple shelf tools. One of them is to just create colored smoke. So if I wanted to, I just go back out here, create a new emitter, and then just say colored smoke, and boom, the setup would be made for us. But a lot of times what you're doing is maybe you decide you want to actually add like some color variation later on down the road. We can add color using this shelf tool. We could go and do it by hand. It would just be as easy as, continuing to add your attributes like we did with V, make sure that it's being rasterized here. That's good. Then you could go back into your smoke sim, go over to your volume source, make sure that it's coming in here. You would want to go back to your fields and turn on this color field as well. And then if you had anything you wanted to do using dissipation over here in your Pyro Solver, you could do that as well. But since there is a shelf tool, let's just use that instead. I'm going to click add color. It's asking me to select a smoke object to make colored. So I'm going to select Pyro over here in my network. I'm going to move my mouse back over the viewport and click enter. And you can see that that has made some colored smoke for us. Now, if I go back to frame 0, you can see that what it's done for us. Now, if I click play, I'm not going to see anything because I'm inside my emitter. But if you look over here at the where is it? At the Pyro source node, it's created a new attribute for us. So let's just select that. You can see that it's added this default color attribute for us to our Pyro source, where we only had density and temperature before. There's now color and alpha that are being added. Now, if I go back out to my Pyro sim and click play, I get this green smoke, which is cool. I could have probably just done this with a shader though. So if I want to actually add some color that is advecting around and mixing, like multicolor mixing, I could do that similar to how we added noise before. You just go back. It's the same old workflow. We can throw down a new noise down here. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to set the default attribute color to black. So it's creating color, but it's creating black. Because then what we'll do is we'll create our own attribute noise. Throw that in here, and it's going to create color. And we're going to create color in a way that is, oops, I'm going to select this. We're going to create color in a way that is additive. So we're adding color to black, if you will. Now, if I had left some color on here, like blue, and we're adding color to that, you can see that there's areas that are whiter and some that are bluer, but if we leave this default value to black and add to it, we get actual color. So I'm just going to mess around with some of this stuff. Let's see here. Maybe I'll choose I'm going to choose to maybe remap the minimum. No. Sorry, remap the values of my noise here. So we get a minimum value of, say, 0 and a maximum value of 1. So we get this sort of multicolored thing going on here. I'm going to turn off velocity trails. And then maybe I'll just bring the element size to be a little bit larger and allow it to be animated. Do I want it to be animated? Yeah, we'll say animated. So now if I click play, you can see that our emitter is generating these different colors. And you won't really see it on this volume rasterize, but when we go back over to our smoke sim, we just go back up here, make sure you got your smoke sim highlighted, or at this point we could even probably dive inside the smoke sim just to see what's going on, and click play. We get all these different colors of smoke that are swirling into one another and eventually forming a whitish color as they all mix together. If I were to go into our smoke object, you can see, like we were looking at before under the fields tab, it's added color like we were talking about. And over here on the velocity, the source density from sphere, you can see that it is added our source volume, which is a vector for RGB, added it to the color target field. And it's using a blend operation here. So if I wanted to do a fire simulation, I could just come out here and throw down an auto dot network, or a dot network rather, and we'll just call this explosion. And what I'll do is create another sphere, and we'll call this our emitter. Well, it's going to call it emitter 1 because we already have an emitter. So yeah, we'll just leave it at that. And then I'm just going to go down here and select my explosion as the if the explosion is selected here. When I use the shelf tool, it's going to actually add DOP objects into this DOP network and not our old DOP network. So I'm going to turn that off for a second. Now, if we wanted to make an explosion, we would just hit our emitter and we could click like fireball. And then it creates, basically the same setup that we did last time, except when we click play now, we get this sort of explosion that looks like flames and smoke all together, like that. Or a fireball, I guess. Explosion is pretty similar to this, except it remains burning a little bit longer, I think, at the end of it. Which is great, but suppose you're working on something and you wanted to add fire to it already. So what we can do is I'm going to take all this stuff over here and just sort of leave it here and turn it off. What I want to actually do is challenge ourselves to really explore the settings of our smoke setup that we have here to add our own sort of pyro, so our own sort of fire into this already existing simulation that we have, just so we can kind of understand what some of the settings are doing. So to do this, I'm going to just disable color for right now. Let's just go over here and turn off the color field, and I'm going to just maybe say the operation down here is set to none. So it's no longer blending in color, but just simply doing nothing. So if we click play, we're pretty much back to where we were in the first place with our smoke sim. So what do we need for fire? Well, let's look over here at the pyro solver again. And if we go to our combustion tab, obviously we're not going to get any fire if we don't enable this section. So let's just enable it and look at what some of these options are here. We've got this ignition temperature. If we scroll over it, we can see that the combustion model will only occur if the temperature field is above this value. So you want to have fuel ignite based off of the temperature. And we know that we're already sourcing in based off of our volume source. We're already sourcing in temperature. And I believe that based off of our emitter, that temperature is a noise pattern that is based off of this negative 1.2 to 1.2 value. So if we're in our smoke sim and on our pyro solver, we're going to set our ignition temperature to some value that's below what that noise range is for the temperature. So a value of 0.1 should be good. That means that fuel is going to start to ignite at this temperature. So but we don't have any fuel in our system in which to ignite. So what I'm going to do is actually go back to our emitter. On this create density node right here, I could add fuel here, but I think what I'll actually do is just add it down here. See, we have this attribute noise. We're creating we're creating a noise attribute for all of our for the temperature of all of our particles. Well, maybe we could do is just add fuel here as well. So we have our attributes that we're creating as density and temperature on this field, and we know fuel is another scalar field, so we'll just throw that in here, fuel. And then down here, when we go to our rasterize, you can see rasterize by default is set to pick up fuel itself. So if I middle mouse click, you can now see that our volumes have added fuel into the list of fields that are being created. So now, if I go back to the smoke sim and click play, there's still not going to be any fire. And the reason for that is that we haven't set the source over here to include fuel as well. So now what I have to do is I'm just going to go over here, and if I click this green arrow on top of any one of these fields, I can add another field. So we click that plus button here. Source volume we created just now was called fuel, and the target field we want to add it to is fuel. So simple as that. We go back to frame 0 and click play. Still not seeing any. Oh, actually you can kind of see a little bit of it going on right here. See that? There we got some flames in there. But they're really obscured by all of this density. So what I want to do is actually dial back the density a little bit. Yeah, let's dial that density down. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn it off by, I could either scale this to 0 or maybe I'll just set this to none. So now when I click play, we do have density occurring in our scene, but that's because if I scroll up here, our pyro solver is actually generating smoke from the flames. So we've got a flame height. We can control the height of these flames, but you can see right here that the density that's coming in now is not coming from our source. It's actually connected to the cooling of the of this flame that is that has been created by the fuel that has been ignited by the temperature. So it's sort of a lot to keep in your head all at once, but it is a bunch of these different physical properties leading to a chain reaction that creates all this stuff. If I turn emit smoke off and click play, it looks like we get these very, very tiny flames and they don't really do too much. But if we turn emit smoke back on, we can actually adjust the smoke amount to be more or less visible. And so here you sort of get this sort of like flame-like effect. And by dialing back that smoke amount, you can really get results that are more like actual smokeless flames if that's what you want, or you can actually increase this value to get much more smoke like burning wood would give you, which is kind of cool. Let's look at some other features of this combustion tab here. We've got our burn rate. The burn rate basically tells us how quickly the fuel burns. So if there's fuel at some location and it is on fire, the percentage of it that burns away is going to be 90% based off of this value. Fuel inefficiency, which is really similar to the burn rate and slightly more confusing, is really what the burn rate is determining is how much of the fuel burns each second. The fuel inefficiency is how much of the fuel that has burned is actually disappears after it's burned. So really, we can actually burn the fuel, but actually leave some of it behind, and that's what creates this inefficiency. The temperature output is basically how much temperature is increased based off of the burning. And then the gas released is also how much, really kind of like how much of a contribution the fuel is making to the scene. So if I increase this gas release to like 100, we can see that it kind of creates more of like an explosion-like effect. and it just gets very large. But if you wanted to create an explosion by hand, you could basically maybe increase this value to like 1,000. Set a keyframe. I'm gonna just turn off the brain for a second, and then go out to like maybe frame 5, and then set this gas release to a value of 0. So if I go back and turn the brain back on and click play, you can see that it creates sort of that explosion-like effect. Also, I mean, if you wanted to not have really, if you wanted it to not continue to burn, you could also keyframe off the different fields that were being added into the scene, or mess around with your ignition temperature. Flame height is really sort of what it sounds like. We can, our flames are a certain height right now. We could actually make them much shorter, and you can see that they actually do not rise as high into the scene. Crank them up, and they get higher. So this is handy if you're trying to art direct, like maybe the size of a campfire, to get this to look really like, campfire, nailed it. If you want this to look like huge flames that are just gigantic, you can crank that value up as well, and get different results in that regard. I'm going to bring gas released. I'm going to delete channels and set it back to 15. And then, I feel like, just to see what we have there with a flame height of maybe 2. Should be good. And let's just modify the temperature output. You can see that this is really just sort of how much temperature is being added to the scene by the combustion. So if I crank that up to a value of like 5, you can see really it's affecting I believe it's affecting how quickly all of this is rising. I believe that's the effect that it's having. Yeah, that appears to be rising very fast when I play it back in real time. When I play back the cache, it's rising very fast because the temperature is super high. If the temperature output's very low, play back this cache. It's kind of hard to tell because we are actually adding our own temperature into the scene as well. So that might be having an effect on it. But you can see it's all just a very delicate and fragile balancing act as you go and mess around with all these parameters to sort of generate the properties of your simulation. Let's look at these other tabs. So we looked over at emit smoke. You can change this to dense smoke, which I think just makes it look even more like a it just basically increases the density of the smoke, more or less. And then I'm just going to turn that off. If we go over to these gas flame contribution and burn contributions, let's see if we crank up the flame contribution and turn down the burn contribution. What does that do for us? Looks like it's more or less, it's creating smaller flames, and it's creating smaller flames and more burn. Burn is what it's creating more flames, but less burn. Burn is what occurs when we are converting something from temperature. Burn is more or less the threshold between the temperature and the flames. So you can see it's like hotter at its core right now because the flame contribution is so high, but not very much is burning anymore. If we crank both of these up, the flames should get pretty large and hot. You can see they're pretty hot right here. And if I bring the flame contribution down, it gets a little bit more mellow. Also, we've got this under this temperature, we can see the flames influencing the cooling rate, and fuel. We can add vector fuel through our simulation. So these are all kind of more subtle effects, but flames influencing the cooling rate basically means that these areas are more or less going to affect how quickly a scene is allowed to cool down the temperature of the simulation. Then fuel. This can be handy for scenes where you want to have your fuel source actually advect through your simulation, and it's sort of subtle here, but what's happening is the fuel is actually being pushed up through the simulation along with these velocity fields to sort of allow it to more or less have a moving, just like how density is being advected through this simulation, fuel is also allowed to advect as well. So that can lead to some different types of effects if that's what you're after. So let's go over here and add a little bit of shredding, see what that does. So over here with shredding, I'm going to just turn this on, and maybe I'm going to actually decrease the amount of smoke that's being emitted here. So let's go to back to our combustion tab and to the smoke tab, and let's say let's see. I'm going to see if I turn off emit smoke. Doesn't like that. It needs a little bit of density in order for it to work, but I'm just going to decrease the smoke amount that is released. And then another thing we could do is we could also go to our pyro solver, or our pyro object, I should say. And if we go over to our guides in our multi-field, we now can kind of mess around with this density scale. So let's bring the density down so we can see something that looks a little bit more like typical flames that don't have so much smoke attached to them. So now you can kind of see that when we add that shredding, we do really kind of get a result that looks a little bit more like a realistic flame that's like at a slightly larger scale than what we had before. You can see like there's a lot of little licks in here and little shards of flame that go flying up. If I go to the shaping tab and kind of turn it off, we can compare. Before, we weren't getting quite as many little like sharp, noisy areas in there, but cranking shredding up, you can really kind of see it break apart into a much more kind of it almost looks a little bit larger scale at this point. Before, we maybe had like a candle flame, and this is looking more like a piece of wood or a campfire burning or something like that. A lot of these fields, if you want to see what they're doing, if we go down to the shredding visualization, you can actually visualize what the shredding is doing to your field by turning on this visualize shredding thing. And this also goes for many of the other fields that we have here. If we turn off the shredding visualization, you can see that there are, I don't think there's really one for disturbance, but for turbulence, there's a visualizer for that. Yeah, I think maybe for, no. Yeah, maybe just shredding and turbulence. At any rate, so those are a bunch of the features that we can use to kind of get a handle over how we can control our pyro simulations. Now, by no means have we really even barely scratched the surface with pyro simulations, but I hope that this is a good primer for you to explore all these different shelf tools that are up here. I would just, basically throw it on a sphere or any type of shape you want to set on fire or explode, and just click away through all these shelf tools, dissect them, and by all means look for any more resources you can find on them, because the learning never ends with the pyro simulations. So in the next example, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of put this stuff into a practical use and create a cool looking design where we fill a shoe. We're going to fill another shoe. We're going to fill a shoe with some smoke, and then we're going to use that smoke to do one of the coolest things about Houdini, which is particle advection, to create even more crazy abstract effects. So I will catch you in that next lesson.